good evening. You're watching World Today. On the top of the show this evening, we are leading with Prime Minister Modi's big message from SCO platform, flagging radicalization as a big threat to peace and security. We will be doing the deep analysis of India's intervention at SCO, the big message that India wants to send across, and much more. We also will be getting you ground report from Afghanistan, which now stares at the worst ever humanitarian crisis of sorts, with unemployment and food scarcity looming large. Plus more international stories. You're watching World Today, your window to the world. I'm Sakalbat, and first up, here are the headlines. Prime Minister says the power transition in Afghanistan was not inclusive and done without negotiations, urges international community to take a thoughtful decision on recognizing Afghanistan government in Kabul after due deliberations. Prime Minister urges the nations to ensure that the Afghanistan territory is not used for fanning terror activities in other nations. Suggests developing collective norms to tackle the menace of terrorism with zero tolerance policy. At the plenary, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres contends its capacity to mediate for a more inclusive Taliban government is limited. Ahead of next week's annual UNGA, UN chief assures UN will be doing everything in its ambit for the country on verge of humanitarian disaster. UN High Commissioner describes Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis as desperate, reaches out to world community for more support. Meanwhile, situation in Afghanistan continues to be grim. More than 18 million Afghans require humanitarian aid, while more than 3.5 million Afghanis already displaced. US has defended Australia's sub-deal, says it is not seeking conflict with China, values partnership with France, while France calls the plans brutal and unpredictable. US and its allies are looking for ways to push back against China's growing power, while China has denounced new Indo-Pacific security alliance between US, Britain and Australia. And also, Russia begins voting for the new parliament as the country's politics remains dominated by Putin's team. Only 14 parties out of 32 registered by Russia's Central Electoral Committee. Main goal before the ruling Russia party is to have peaceful elections that can be considered legitimate. And let's begin with the top story on World Today. Well, Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the SCO Outreach Summit on Afghanistan a while back. Prime Minister proposed increased focus on 4 major issues. First point related to giving recognition to Taliban regime in the landlocked nation. Prime Minister stressed that it is essential that the global community takes a decision on the recognition of the new system collectively and with proper deliberation. He added that on this matter, India supports the central role of United Nations.
पहला मुद्दा यह है कि अफगानिस्तान में सत्ता परिवर्तन इंक्लूसिव नहीं है और बिना नेगोशिएशंस के हुआ है। इससे नई व्यवस्था की स्वीकार्यता पर सवाल उठते हैं। महिलाओं तथा अल्पसंख्यकों सहित अफगान समाज के सभी वर्गों का प्रतिनिधित्व भी महत्वपूर्ण है और इसलिए यह आवश्यक है कि नई व्यवस्था की मान्यता पर फैसला ग्लोबल कम्युनिटी सोच समझकर और सामूहिक तरह से लें।
The second major issue that Prime Minister underlined was the need to fight terror. He urged the nations to ensure that Afghanistan's territory is not again used as a terror launching ground in other nations. He also called for developing a collective form on fighting terror.
हम सभी देश पहले भी आतंकवाद से पीड़ित रहे हैं और इसलिए हमें मिलकर सुनिश्चित करना चाहिए कि अफगानिस्तान की धरती का उपयोग किसी भी देश में आतंकवाद फैलाने के लिए न हो। एससीओ के सदस्य देशों को इस विषय पर सख्त और साझा नॉर्म्स विकसित करने चाहिए। आगे चलकर ये नॉर्म्स वैश्विक एंटी टेरर सहयोग के लिए भी एक टेम्पलेट बन सकते हैं। ये नॉर्म्स आतंकवाद के प्रति जीरो टॉलरेंस के सिद्धांत पर आधारित होने चाहिए। इनमें क्रॉस बॉर्डर टेररिज्म और टेरर फाइनेंसिंग जैसी गतिविधियों पर रोक लगाने के लिए एक कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट होना चाहिए।
Prime Minister also highlighted the need to keep tab on proliferation in drug, weapon and human trafficking after the change of regime in Afghanistan.
अफगानिस्तान के घटनाक्रम से जुड़ा तीसरा विषय यह है कि इससे ड्रग्स, अवैध हथियारों और ह्यूमन ट्रैफिकिंग का अनियंत्रित प्रवाह बढ़ सकता है। बड़ी मात्रा में एडवांस वेपन्स अफगानिस्तान में रह गए हैं। इनके कारण पूरे क्षेत्र में अस्थिरता का खतरा बना रहेगा। इन फ्लोज को मॉनिटर करने और इंफॉर्मेशन शेयरिंग बढ़ाने के लिए एससीओ रैट्स मैकेनिज्म्स सकारात्मक भूमिका निभा सकता है।
And finally, the last point Prime Minister sought the attention of participants was a deteriorating humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, and he reiterated India's resolve to help the nation.
अफगानिस्तान में गंभीर ह्यूमैनिटेरियन क्राइसिस का है। फाइनेंशियल और ट्रेड फ्लोज में रुकावट के कारण अफगान जनता की आर्थिक व्यवस्था बढ़ती जा रही है। साथ में कोविड की चुनौती भी उनके लिए यातना का कारण है। विकास और मानवीय सहायता के लिए भारत बहुत वर्षों से अफगानिस्तान का विश्वस्त पार्टनर रहा है।
Earlier, Prime Minister Modi addressed the plenary session of the 21st meeting of SCO Council of Heads of State in Dushanbe in Tajikistan virtually. Prime Minister said that 20th anniversary of the SCO is the right time to think about the future of SCO, adding that the biggest challenge in this area are related to peace, security and trust deficit, and the root cause of these problems is increasing radicalization. In fact, recent developments in Afghanistan, Prime Minister said, have made these challenges more clear.
एससीओ की 20वीं वर्षगांठ इस संस्था के भविष्य के बारे में सोचने के लिए भी उपयुक्त अवसर है। मेरा मानना है कि इस क्षेत्र में सबसे बड़ी चुनौतियां शांति, सुरक्षा और ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट से संबंधित है और इन समस्याओं का मूल कारण बढ़ता हुआ रेडिकलाइजेशन है। अफगानिस्तान में हाल के घटनाक्रम ने इस चुनौती को और स्पष्ट कर दिया है। इस मुद्दे पर एससीओ को पहल लेकर कार्य करना चाहिए।
Prime Minister said that there exists moderate and inclusive, tolerant institutions related to Islam in India and SCO countries, adding that SCO should work to set up a strong network among them. Prime Minister also hailed the fruitful work done by RATS mechanism of the SCO.
भारत में और एससीओ के लगभग सभी देशों में इस्लाम से जुड़ी मॉडरेट, टॉलरेंट और इंक्लूसिव संस्थाएं और परंपराएं हैं। एससीओ को इनके बीच एक मजबूत नेटवर्क विकसित करने के लिए काम करना चाहिए। इस संदर्भ में मैं एससीओ के रैट्स मैकेनिज्म द्वारा किए जा रहे उपयोगी कार्य की प्रशंसा करता हूं।
Prime Minister said that India is committed to increasing its connectivity with Central Asia. However, he added that any connectivity initiative cannot be one way. So to ensure mutual trust, connectivity projects should be consultative, transparent and participatory. He also said that there should be respect for the territorial integrity of all countries.
कनेक्टिविटी की कोई भी पहल वन वे स्ट्रीट नहीं हो सकती। आपसी ट्रस्ट सुनिश्चित करने के लिए कनेक्टिविटी प्रोजेक्ट्स को कंसल्टेटिव, पारदर्शी और पार्टिसिपेटरी होना चाहिए। इनमें सभी देशों की टेरिटोरियल इंटीग्रिटी का सम्मान निहित होना चाहिए। इन सिद्धांतों के आधार पर एससीओ को क्षेत्र में कनेक्टिविटी प्रोजेक्ट्स के लिए उपयुक्त नॉर्म्स विकसित करने चाहिए।
And let's try and deeply analyze the message that India or Prime Minister Narendra Modi wants to send across from the SCO platform, especially the takeover of Taliban in Afghanistan and overall messaging. In fact, we're very glad to be joined on the show by Anil Kumar Trigniyat, former Indian ambassador, former senior diplomat, joining us on the show. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. And also extremely glad to have Professor Swaran Singh, foreign affairs expert, also on the show. Thank you very much. Good evening to you, Professor Singh. I'm going to start with Ambassador, sir, with you very quickly now, especially on that point made by Honorable Prime Minister about the transition of power in Afghanistan, lending the legitimacy part to it, that it was not inclusive and the world should take a call after due deliberations. What do you think the message, what is the larger message that India wants to send across, and the position that India has now taken on this?
Well, as you know that India is also was the chair last month of the UN Security Council, and during that one of the on Afghanistan there was a UN Security Council resolution 2593 was passed as a result of India's efforts, where China and Russia had abstained, and it was exactly the same thing. It was said that the inclusive government, human rights, they should be there, and there has Afghanistan, we are seeing an interim government at the moment, but that government does not seem to be inclusive. That's what is very important from the global perspective, as well as there is rights of women, which Prime Minister very clearly mentioned, are also need to be respected, because whatever reports are coming from there are quite disconcerting. So he very clearly mentioned that, and that means that the India's position remains the same, that the Taliban government currently, as you know, that nobody mentioned the name Taliban in this whole thing in that sense of the term. So it has been urged that the international community, especially within the SCO, all the countries, because we know that there are reports that Pakistan, China are really working overtime to somehow provide legitimacy to the government. So the message was that let us take a call which should be jointly and taken into account. All the red lines have been agreed to by the Taliban and the new government. So that is very, very clear in this, and I think that that is the right way to go, because one has to, international community needs to maintain the pressure. The regime should not depend on the division between various members of the SCO and the international community, especially the key countries especially like China, should not be carried away, because that will dilute the whole process in the long term. So I think that all the points that Prime Minister mentioned and made were very relevant. And apart from that, it urged the SCO to really stick to what it stands for, that is fighting terrorism. And as far as connectivity was concerned, you know that it was basically to inform China. And as far as cross-border terrorism was concerned, it was to tell Pakistan that the world cannot have double standards. There should be zero tolerance for terrorism. So I think that he has made all the points that are needed to, whether the organization is able to come up with some kind of norms or mechanisms, as he calls, or the template he calls for, remains to be seen. Of course, India, when was chairing the Reds last year, we had hosted it. So at that time, India had come up with several recommendations in this regard. And as you know, even in the BRICS, India had chaired for the, started the counter-terrorism. Yes, so the same thing is being applied here. And I hope the other countries follow suit on that.
Okay, Professor Singh, do you agree with Ambassador Tigriat? And also when Prime Minister talks about the stricter norms, quote unquote, to deal with the situation, and considering the member nations that are part of SCO as we speak, it's a very aggressive line, a hard line that India has once again taken. It's zero tolerance on terror.
Clearly, I think India for last about 3 months, and now it is being reiterated by Prime Minister at this very large gathering of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, along with the collective treaty organization of 6 nations, so 27 nations together of Eurasia. Benchmarks that India has placed on the ground as to what would require in case international community and India had to recognize Taliban as a legitimate government in Kabul. So I think it's also very interesting to see that just as on the eve of next Friday's in-person quadrilateral security framework summit in Washington, D.C., where Prime Minister will be attending, and he's going there, President Joe Biden has just announced something called AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom and US new arrangement for the Indo-Pacific. In that backdrop, I think this meeting of both Indian Foreign Minister being on the ground in Dushanbe and Indian Prime Minister addressing, underlining one after another benchmarks that India would like to see as India engages with this larger region, as to how this main challenge of radicalization that Taliban's success in taking over power in Taliban could trigger, and how collectively in one voice one can think of leading this SCO and CSTO together, and using institutions which are already built, the regional anti-terrorism structure of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was built in 2004 onwards, and is very active structure to take off, look after extremism, radicalism, etc. And also at the same time, Shanghai Cooperation Organization has had something called a contact group on Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been an observer country in SCO. So SCO is an ideal location where you can think of how to bring all the stakeholders who are going to be immediately impacted upon, and some of them are engaging Russia.
No, but here we're looking in terms of stakeholder. Let me, in fact, you raised that very pertinent point, sir. I want Ambassador, sir, to react on that here, and also Professor Swain, you also. Here we're talking about Afghanistan as a stakeholder, but Afghanistan where Taliban is ruling the roost, and where the legitimacy to the Taliban's administration is still in limbo.
Well, that is right. I mean, if you come to think of it, the SCO, when it came into being in 2001, was also in the Afghanistan. I mean, when it first time came, and the 4 countries out of the 8 actually do have the boundaries, and with Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is central to the SCO in that sense of the term. And after 9/11 only, I mean, we saw that the terrorism and other things that will start increasing, that the SCO was founded. So that remains very much the case, and that is one reason that even though Afghanistan has been asking for full membership, it has been for a very long time not been possible to make it a full member. It is still an observer in the organization. In fact, on July 16, the previous foreign minister had again gone to the SCO and tried to plead for a full membership as Iran has become a member this time. So it is important because see, the Taliban is there, that's also a landlocked country. They need to depend on their neighbors essentially for doing anything, and all the neighbors, and as Professor said, all the stakeholders actually are present in this organization. And therefore it is extremely important that if this organization does take a whatever a united approach on the thing, that then Taliban can stay on course. Of course, the problem is also within Taliban there are different groups and who are at cross purposes with one section of the Taliban. So Pakistan is the older country in this whole thing. So I think that Pakistan was trying to bring the Taliban group to be part of this meeting at the same time. They've been talking to, but the Tajik president refused. And so is Imran Khan also. So they told them beforehand that it will not be possible to recognize. But how long will it continue? As you see, the United Nations has already committed about $1 billion from various countries. The situation in Afghanistan is worsening. And the worsening situation could lead to greater problems as far as terrorism is concerned. So I think that we have to take it immediately bull by the horn.
Professor Swain, Professor Singh wants to come in, please.
I think it's interesting to make a distinction between how international community is engaging Afghanistan as separate from engaging Taliban. For example, $61 million of humanitarian aid from United States or $31 million of aid from China is coming to deal with the humanitarian catastrophe that is likely to happen in Afghanistan. That has nothing to do with the recognition of Taliban as a regime. Of course, we understand that Pakistan, Russia, China are maintaining their missions in Kabul and are in direct communication with Taliban, of course. But that also, I think, is not a reflection of their, direct and open recognition of Taliban. Even they are hesitant. You just notice that, when they formed the interim government, they had invited 6 countries' representatives. Not one country responded. So international community is as yet, I think, united, except that the benchmarks for each of these sometimes could be different. And that is where Prime Minister's intervention and speech today at the summit meeting of both SCO and the outreach with the CSTO is a very important attempt. And foreign ministers on the ground talking to various other leaders there in Dushanbe to make sure that there is a collective view taken on the subject as to what would be the benchmarks on which Taliban must prove itself on the ground before any kind of recognition, a formal recognition is extended to Taliban. And that is, I don't think, coming very easily. What also marks a difference is that compared to speech that Indian Prime Minister had in UN Security Council when he was chairing it, or when the resolution was passed later, direct mention of Afghanistan was avoided because that's a very different platform. But here, because the platform involves all the direct stakeholders who are getting impacted with what happens in Afghanistan, a detailed mention of Afghanistan was clearly made by the Prime Minister, because here we are talking to countries that are going to be really impacted upon as to how radicalization expands from success of Taliban on the ground. Not necessarily because Taliban would like to do that directly, but even the example of Taliban taking over power is going to inspire some other outfits.
Absolutely.
Or the factional fights of Taliban could allow some space to some of these radical elements to go and sort of spread that ideology around. So radicalization of Eurasia, I think, is something that Prime Minister has underlined is the immediate threat, and that is where we need to really address this problem collectively and put some really important benchmarks for Taliban to really address and accept those kind of conditions.
Ambassador Trikhniyat, that very quickly on the terror part, where Prime Minister once again reiterated that the launching grounds, Afghanistan, we have to ensure that the territory there is not used by terror launch pads, etc. Not really mentioning Pakistan, but the fact that you have that country part of the same grouping, the fact that Imran Khan is giving out interviews to international media justifying Haqqanis and good Taliban and bad Taliban, and at that juncture you have a summit like this where India has taken such a strong position against terror and questioning the very legitimacy question, So do you think this is something which also puts a sort of pressure on Pakistan to speak up and come clean on this?
It is the hero of terrorism. Everybody knows using terror as an instrument of policy is a given. So there is no question about it. And right now what it groups like the NET and JEM are shifting to southern part of Afghanistan just so that Pakistan could be able to get out of the FATF, which is doing that now. Even though Prime Minister has not mentioned Pakistan by name, but he has implied because this is a regional organization and therefore all the members of the bilateral issues are not brought in. But India's concerns have been expressed very clearly and the whole world is actually worried about the terrorism fallout.
All right. Professor Singh, you want to come in here?
I think it's important for us to really take care of our interests directly, and that is where this repeated assertion of territory of Afghanistan not to be used against India's interest is very important to underline. Also, defense and protection of people of Indian origin, not just of Indian citizens, has been underlined repeatedly. And the fear that the possibilities of some other outfits finding space in a sort of unstable political situation in Taliban is where international community support has to be calibrated, and India is doing that, to do it together with several other nations, both in Eurasia but also in the Western nations when it is going to engage European nations and now in quadrilateral security framework. So it's a well-calibrated approach to protect India's national interest and Indian national security.
All right, on that note, many thanks both of you gentlemen for joining us on World Today. Ambassador Trigniath and also Professor Swarn Singh, thank you sir for joining, both of you, thank you. And we stay with this big story. Now, meanwhile, United Nations will be doing everything in its ambit it can for a country that UN chief says is on the verge of dramatic humanitarian disaster. We have shifted focus to the situation on ground in Afghanistan and what UN is saying. Now, UN has decided, it says it has decided to engage with Taliban in order to help Afghanistan's nearly 36 million people. That's half of its population. Now, even before the Taliban seizure of the capital Kabul, half of the country's population depended on aid in Afghanistan. And amidst these recent developments, drought and shortages of food and unemployment is settling in. In fact, the World Food Program has warned that around 14 million people are on the brink of starvation there. Here's a report.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said any suggestion the world body can solve Afghanistan's problem is a fantasy and that its capacity to mediate for a more inclusive Taliban government is limited. Asked in an interview with Reuters a month after Taliban took control of Afghanistan from Western-backed government whether he felt the pressure to repair the country's plight, Guterres said the expectation is unfounded of UN influence as the main international organization still on the ground there.
I think there is an expectation that is unfounded. I mean, we have a number of countries that have used hundreds of thousands of soldiers for decades, that have spent trillions for decades. And to think that even if they have failed with all these resources to fix the problems of Afghanistan, the UN can now, without that money and without those forces, the UN can now solve the problems that they didn't solve for decades is of course a fantasy.
The UN will be doing everything it can for the country that Guterres said is on the verge of dramatic humanitarian disaster and has decided to engage the Taliban in order to help Afghans, roughly 36 million people. Even before Taliban seizure of capital Kabul, half the country's population depended on aid that is set to increase due to drought and shortages, and the World Food Program has warned 14 million people were on the brink of starvation.
We are totally committed simultaneously to work with all other international organizations that are in Afghanistan, support the NGO movement that is working there, to do everything for the Afghan people. The Afghan people is on the verge of a dramatic humanitarian situation. It's our duty to do everything possible to support the Afghans.
Humanitarian aid, Guterres said, should be used as an instrument to help convince the Taliban to respect fundamental rights, including those of women and girls. Guterres also appealed for countries to make sure Afghan economy is not completely strangled.
It's important that the country is not completely strangled. There must be ways to inject some cash in the Afghan economy, and I don't put into question, of course, the measures that were taken by the international community, but there must be ways to inject some cash in the Afghan economy, for the economy not to collapse, and for the people not to be in a dramatic situation, forcing probably millions to flee, what would be a terrible disaster for the region.
World reaction to the government of Taliban, veterans and hardliners announced last week has been cool, and there has been no sign of international recognition on moves to unblock more than $9 billion in foreign reserves held outside of Afghanistan. He said UN will work with its partners to ensure that aid is distributed based on humanitarian principles and that everybody should be treated equally without any kind of distinction based on gender or ethnicity or any other consideration.
What I can tell you is that we will be operating in the whole territory. We have asked for access to the whole territory. We were granted that access. And we will be working with our partners in order to make sure that the aid is distributed based on humanitarian principles, which means based on the needs of the population, and that everybody should be treated equally without any kind of distinction based on gender or based on ethnicity or any other consideration.
Guterres emphasized that it is too early to know if Taliban will respect rights and govern responsibly. He called the situation in Afghanistan unpredictable, adding, "Nobody knows what will happen, but it's important to engage." World Today Desk, DD India.
Meanwhile, the grim unemployment situation in Afghanistan remains a major concern and challenge for the Taliban government, and the suspension of foreign aid have plunged the war-torn country into deeper crisis. Afghanistan has been largely dependent on the foreign aid for the last 20 years. In fact, the World Bank has said that over 47% of the Afghan population lived below the national poverty line in 2020, and that the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, has also claimed that 97% of Afghans could sink below the poverty line by the middle of 2022. Now, this impact of the economic crisis can be seen in the city as a number of day laborers are waiting for work, and this is something which increases every passing day. And the fast-evolving cash crisis in Afghanistan has taken a toll on both businesses, operations and the people's livelihoods across the country. Although the Afghan Central Bank has resumed operations, many banks have still remained closed, with worried residents seen lining up outside the bank outlets for the cash withdrawal. And as cash is the main payment means in the country, the ongoing cash shortage has not only made it difficult for the Afghan people to survive, but also has limited the country's business activities of all time. Although an aid package of over $1 billion has been pledged by the international community, 1 in every 3 Afghan people are suffering major food shortage as a result of soaring prices, the severe humanitarian crisis in the country, and the possibility of economic collapse across the country. Meanwhile, the border posts in Afghanistan continue to witness desperate attempts by the Afghans to flee the country. The Torkham border crossing on the Pakistani side of the border with Afghanistan was crowded with hundreds of people on Thursday amid tight controls. The crossing at Torkham, now manned on the Afghan side by armed Taliban soldiers, has long been the busiest between the two countries, but since last month has seen a sharp dip in pedestrian crossings as tight controls have been imposed. Many were coming from the Afghan side, claiming they were fleeing from the tough times they see ahead as the Taliban government settles into the power in Afghanistan after 20 years of American occupation. The Taliban have tried to present a more moderate face to the world, but many Afghans fear reprisals and a return to the harsh version of the Islamic law that the Taliban enforced when they were in power from 1996 to 2001, in particular the repression of women and freedom of speech. Taliban officials have urged Afghans not to leave, saying they are needed to help them run the country and make it prosper in near future. Meanwhile, the UN High Commissioner for the Refugees has asked for more support as he's described Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis as desperate, more than a month after the Taliban's takeover. During his 3-day visit, UN's Filippo Grandi was shown around a warehouse filled with relief items. Even before the Taliban took over last month, Grandi said in written statement more than 18 million Afghans, or about half the million population, required humanitarian aid. More than 3.5 million Afghans were already displaced in the country that is battling drought amid COVID-19 situation. News back home in India. India on Friday achieved an unprecedented milestone as it jabbed over 2 crore vaccines doses in a single day, the highest so far and shattering all previous records of single-day vaccinations. The government came on the achievement came on the occasion of the 71st birthday of Prime Minister Modi, and so far India has already jabbed more than 2.05 crore doses of COVID-19 vaccines, bettering the previous best of 1.41 crore vaccine doses in a single day, which was achieved on August 31st. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that Washington would continue to cooperate with Paris in an attempt aimed at calming French anger. This after the United States, Australia and UK clinched the historic defence export contract to supply Australia with submarines. Meanwhile, France, which loses its own submarine deal with Australia, has called the plans brutal and unpredictable. Reacting angrily to the loss of the deal, France called it a stab in the back. Here's more.
The White House on Thursday defended the US decision to provide Australia with advanced technology for nuclear-powered submarines, rejecting criticism from both China and France over the deal. White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki said the agreement announced on Wednesday is not aimed at China, although the United States has mounting concerns about Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region.
As it relates to China, we welcome stiff competition with the PRC. We do not seek conflict.
France, which loses its own submarine deal with Australia, called the plans brutal and unpredictable. Reacting angrily, France called it a stab in the back. The US is now trying its best to calm down its European allies, especially France. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken also said that Washington would continue to cooperate with Paris, comments that appeared aimed at calming French anger after the United States, Australia and the United Kingdom clinched the historic defence export contract to supply Australia with submarines. Blinken said Washington had been in touch with its French counterparts before the announcement of the submarine deal.
We've been in touch with French counterparts in the last 48 hours to discuss AUKUS, including before the announcement. I'll leave it to our Australian partners to describe why they sought this new technology. But as the President said, and I want to emphasize again, we cooperate incredibly closely with France on many shared priorities in the Indo-Pacific, but also beyond, around the world. We're going to continue to do so.
In 2016, Australia had selected French shipbuilder Naval Group to build a new submarine fleet worth $40 billion to replace its more than 2 decades old Collins submarines. Meanwhile, the European Union has also reacted sharply to the new deal. EU's top diplomat has said that the new US security pact with Australia and Britain shows that the European Union must develop its own defence and security strategies, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said he was not consulted on Wednesday's agreement.
I guess a deal of this nature wasn't cooked up the other day. It takes a while. Despite that, no, we were not consulted. We were stakeholders, and this forces us once again. And it's a good opportunity to remind ourselves to reflect on the need to make the issue of European strategic autonomy a priority. This shows that we must survive on our own.
Borrell was responding to journalists' questions after a presentation of a new strategy aimed at boosting the 27-member bloc's presence in the Indo-Pacific region. The plan is meant to give the EU a higher diplomatic profile on Indo-Pacific issues, to give more EU personnel and investment in the region, and a security presence such as dispatching ships through the South China Sea. China has also denounced the new Indo-Pacific Security Alliance between the United States, Britain and Australia, saying such partnerships should not target third countries and warning of an intensified arms race in the region. World Today Desk, DD India.
And Australia and US will be significantly enhancing force posture cooperation, which will see increased interoperability and deepening their alliance activities in the Indo-Pacific region. And this would also mean rotational deployments of the US military aircraft to Australia. But in a stern warning to China, US has said it will not leave Australia alone on the pitch in face of pressure tactics of Beijing's use of economic coercion against Australia. That's a strong warning from US to China. Here's more.
Australia and US have reached new force posture agreements that will see greater air cooperation through rotational deployments of all types of US military aircraft to Australia, the Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton said on Thursday. Speaking at a joint news conference after meetings between US and Australian foreign and defence ministers in Washington, Dutton said the two sides would be significantly enhancing the force posture cooperation, increasing interoperability and deepening alliance activities in the Indo-Pacific.
I'm proud to announce that Australia and the United States will be significantly enhancing our force posture cooperation, increasing interoperability and deepening alliance activities in the Indo-Pacific. This will include greater air cooperation through rotational deployments of all types of US military aircraft to Australia.
US Secretary of Defence Lloyd Austin said that the meeting endorsed major force posture initiatives that will expand access and presence in Australia for the US. Dutton and Austin spoke a day after the United States and Britain said they would provide Australia with the technology and capability to deploy nuclear-powered submarines. The United States and its allies are looking for ways to push back against China's growing power and influence, particularly its military buildup, pressure on Taiwan and deployments in the contested South China Sea.
The world saw China's aggressive response when Australia led calls for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. And Beijing has seen over the past months that Australia will not back down and that threats of economic retaliation and pressure simply will not work. I also want to reiterate what I've said before. The United States will not leave Australia alone on the field, or better yet, on the pitch, in the face of these pressure tactics. We've raised publicly and privately our serious concerns about Beijing's use of economic coercion against Australia. We've made it clear that actions like these targeting our allies will hinder improvements in our own relationship with the Chinese government.
The three countries announced on Wednesday that they would establish a security partnership for the Indo-Pacific that will help Australia acquire US nuclear-powered submarines and scrap the $40 billion French-designed submarine deal. World Today Desk, DD India.
Workers began installing a fence around the U.S. Capitol late on Wednesday ahead of a protest scheduled for September 18th, and police has asked the National Guard to be ready to help with security if needed. A large group is expected at the Capitol Hill on Saturday to protest the arrest and criminal charges pressed against some 600 people in connection with the 6th Jan riot by supporters of former President Donald Trump. The tall fence was first erected following the January 6th attack on the building that houses the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. It was dismantled in July. The U.S. Capitol Police on Wednesday said it has asked the Pentagon to provide National Guard troops if they are needed to help with security. Trump falsely claimed that the election was stolen from him as a result of massive election fraud. He gave a fiery speech to supporters at the rally on January 6 outside the White House just prior to their attack on the Capitol. Battling law enforcement outside and inside the Capitol, the rioters were trying to stop Congress from the formal certification of Joe Biden's victory in the November 2020 presidential elections. Many of these January 6 rioters carried Trump flags, which at times were used as weapons against law enforcement. 4 people died on the day of the riot, 1 fatally shot by police, 3 from medical emergencies. Capitol police officer who had been attacked by protesters died the following day. 4 police officers who took part in the defense of the Capitol later also committed suicide. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden on Thursday expressed confidence that Congress will deliver both an infrastructure and supplementary spending bills to his desk that would infuse trillions of dollars into the U.S. economy. Biden's speech comes as Democrats write $3.5 billion spending bill that funds child care, community college and other social programs with an increase in taxes on companies and the very wealthy, and debates a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. Democrats in Congress are writing $3.5 trillion spending bill that funds child care, community college and other social programs with an increase in taxes on companies and the very wealthy. The party seeks to pass the massive package as a companion to $1 trillion infrastructure bill that has bipartisan support. And while the...
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking the House committees for working hard this week to advance critical components of the economic plan that I put before the Congress. I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm confident the Congress will deliver to my desk both the bipartisan physical infrastructure plan and the Build Back Better plan that I have proposed. And I've said many times before, I believe we're at an inflection point in this country. One of those moments where the decisions we're about to make can change, literally change the trajectory of our nation for years and possibly decades to come.
While the infrastructure plan has support on both sides of the aisle, Democrats in the Senate, where they narrowly hold control, face a tough battle to finalize the plan that would expand the social safety net. As Republicans decline to support or negotiate on the $3.5 trillion package, Senate Democrats are taking a route known as budget reconciliation to pass the bill with a simple majority vote. Now, the party must convince moderate members in their own ranks like Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kristen Sinema of Arizona to back the bill, and both have raised questions about the size and scope of the program. From US, let's move on to Russia, where residents of Russian Far East city of Petropavlovsk were among the first voters who went to the polls on Friday to elect a new parliament in a three-day vote that the ruling United Russia Party is expected to win despite ratings slump after the biggest crackdown on the Kremlin's critics in years. The vote is a test of President Vladimir Putin's grip on power across 11 time zones, from the Pacific Ocean to the Baltic Sea, as the Kremlin faces malaise at home over faltering living standards and dire ties with the West. At stake is United Russia's supermajority in the 450-seat State Duma, which last year helped Putin ease through constitutional reforms that allow him to run for office again and potentially stay in power until 2036. The vote runs until late Sunday and is seen as a dry run for the presidential elections in 2024, a highly sensitive moment for the Kremlin should it choose to embark on a political transition to a new figurehead. Now, the Kremlin leader's fiercest domestic critic, jailed anti-corruption firebrand Alexei Navalny, hopes a tactical voting campaign led by his team in exile can upstage United Russia and hurt its bid to secure a hefty new majority. His allies, who accuse the Kremlin of sweeping crackdown, have no chance of gaining even a toehold in real politics after they were barred from running for office because of their association with Navalny's network. The elections in Moscow and several regions will feature the widespread use of electronic voting for the first time, and innovation critics fear is non-transparent and open to abuse as well. Some more international news. Shares of Macau casino operators on September 15th shed as much as a third of their value, losing about $18 billion as the government kicked off a regulatory overhaul that could see its officials supervising companies in the world's largest gambling hub. With Macau's lucrative casino licenses up for rebidding next year, the plan spooked a Hong Kong market already deep in the red after Beijing's regulatory crackdown on sectors from technology to education and property that sliced hundreds of billions of dollars of assets values. US casino companies also fell for the second straight day, losing as much as $4 billion in market capitalization on Wednesday, with Las Vegas Sands slumping to more than year low, Wynn Resorts and MGM Resorts International dropping 8% and 5% respectively. The slump came after Lee Wai-nong, Macau's Secretary for Economy and Finance, gave notice on Tuesday of a 45-day consultation period on the gambling industry to begin from the following day, pointing to deficiencies in industry supervision. Thousands of migrants have converged under the bridge that connects Del Rio, Texas and Mexico's Ciudad Cuna, creating a makeshift camp with few basic services and intense heat in the latest border emergency facing United States President Joe Biden. Food and water has been scarce. Around 20 migrants told Reuters, the news agency, and temperatures have risen to around 37 degrees Celsius. News agency Reuters witnessed hundreds of migrants wading through the Rio Grande River and back into Mexico to stop up on essentials they say they're not receiving on the American side. The squalid conditions are reflective of the humanitarian challenge facing Biden as border arrests hover around 20-year highs. U.S. authorities have arrested more than 1,95,000 migrants at the Mexican border in August, according to the government data released. Biden has rolled back many of the hardline immigration measures of the Republican predecessor, former President Donald Trump, but he has been caught between pro-migrant groups and some Democrats who have criticized him for not doing more to help migrants, and opponents who say his policies have encouraged illegal immigration. Both migrants and Mexican officials say many more people are expected in the coming days. And with that, it's time to wrap up this edition of World Today. We'll be back tomorrow at same time. World Today, your daily 1-hour roundup of top trending international stories. Your window to the world, only on DD India. Thanks for tuning in. Namaskar.